Okay. So we're talking about the game setting today, and we're gonna start thinking about creating art and sort of building out the game world. So now that we have a character, you can start to think about what goes around this character to create the sort of fictional world that the game exists in. So we'll talk about a few different terms and also try to kind of like clarify different ideas when it comes to setting versus other aspects of building the game world. Um, so let's just get started. So I have this like this kind of like cool aquarium image from a little a website that's linked at the bottom. And I like to use this as kind of an example of like thinking about the setting or the relationship between the setting and the world when thinking about game design. And so the thing that I like about aquarium and other types of designing these kind of spaces is that you have to kind of think about how to create like an imitation of the world with a very few elements, right? Like compared to the actual real world where there's just like so many different things everywhere all the time that create the world that we live in. Whether it's like what we were just talking about, like paper and iPads and pencils and all of this other stuff, like the game world that we create, we only have a certain amount of time, first of all, to create everything that goes into the world. And we also only have a certain amount of like space and memory on the computer and other concerns that we have. So we have to think about choosing elements that really, fit together well to reinforce the fictional world and the narrative and all the other components of the game that we're creating. And so you can see in this little fishbowl, we have like these different areas. They have some things in common. They have some things that are different. There's different colors. One of the things that stands out is like each bowl has like a different sort of like flower with like a different color, but they all have little green leaves and stuff like that. And they also have like the brown sand. And so there's these different elements that go into designing a space that makes it kind of like easy to understand from the perspective of either the fish who are living in this aquarium or like the player who's in our game. So we have this like confined space, and we have to think about what to put in it to create sort of our world, our fictional world that tells the player where they are. So one thing to kind of differentiate here is the game setting versus world building as a general concept. So you guys have probably thought about world building when you've talked about games or talked about like TV shows in particular, especially like long running TV shows or, movie series or things like that. Um, they're related, but one is kind of like more general, like the idea of world building is kind of just like the general practice of like inventing this fictional space and fictional universe that usually involves a lot of stuff that the player or the viewer never actually encounters. So world building is about thinking about everything that exists in this world that our game takes place, and then the setting is pulling out elements of that world that really convey to the player or the viewer, what is actually happening in this world. So we need to think about those different elements. Like, what are the elements that will convey the setting or the world that we've created the most sort of like efficiently, like that will really tell the user where they are. So as I mentioned, the game's fictional world is much larger in scope than what the player sees. And the setting elements are what are used along with other things like the player and everything else. But the setting elements are one big part that reveals that world to the player. So we need enough details to understand how the world works. Like if we're underwater, we need to see that we're underwater. And then when there's, less gravity, when we float a little bit, we'll understand why. So the setting conveys aspects of the functionality and the logic of the world, as well as just the general setting. So then we have game setting versus level design. So level design is something we'll get into a little bit later in the semester as we build out our games. Level design is sort of like how the player gets through the game. Game setting is still just like the elements that make up that level design. So that's the objects, backgrounds, different visuals that kind of set the scene for the game. Level design has more to do with the way that we draw the player through the game. So that involves the setting, but it also involves player interaction, the physics of the world, obstacles and rewards, and goals like we talked about in the first week of class. So game setting is used to enhance the level design, but it's only one component of creating a level or good level design. So a few types of game worlds that we may encounter. We can kind of like choose the type of game world that we want to go to, and there's also like hybrid game worlds. But we have to make a few choices about the world that the game takes place in that kind of determine what we put in that world as far as the setting and other elements. So let's think if we can think of a game that takes place in each of these different types of worlds. So if you have an idea, you can just shout it on the mic or put it in the chat. So different types of settings. So there's a fantasy game world. If
Like
you guys
Final
think of,
Fantasy.
that's a good one. Yeah,
Yep.
it's in the title.
Legend of
World
So
of
that's a good
Zelda.
example.
Warcraft.
Uh-huh. And so what makes a fantasy setting? What is it about fantasy that makes it different from other types?
Well, it
Is
usually
it that
involves like
it's
mythical creatures, or just like
Sorry, say that
exaggerated.
again.
Like a fantasy setting usually will involve like mythical creatures or like extravagant or exaggerated worlds.
Yeah. So those are good examples, and the thing that all those have in common is that they're not real, right? They're not part of the real world, at least the real world that we experience. So if you have a fire-breathing dragon in your game, that's going to tell the player that it's a fantasy world. So that means the basic constraints of our real world don't necessarily apply. Like there could be magic, there could be other things that don't happen in the real world. So that's basically that's one component of fantasy. So let's keep going. So perspective world. So something about the character's perspective is changed. So this means that most of the world is the same, but there's something about the character that's different than what we experience in the real world. Can you guys think of any examples of that one?
Like the character itself is different than the rest of the characters or the world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Octodad.
What's Octodad?
I think
Uh,
Mario is a perfect example.
it's like an octopus that's a father taking care of his family.
So the rest of the family is just like people?
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
I
like
played that game.
normal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can
Yeah, that's a
say
great that's
I can say Sora from Kingdom Hearts.
what's that?
Sora from Kingdom Hearts. It's
Oh,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, that's a good one. So like another example, like a sort of like past example of this that I like to bring up is Rip Van Winkle. Are you guys familiar with that story?
Kind of.
Yeah.
Okay, so you might have read it in like middle school or high school or something like that. But Rip Van Winkle is basically an early like short story about a guy who falls asleep for 20 years and then he wakes up and everything has changed. So that's another example of a perspective world that
Wait, wait,
doesn't
wait.
really involve
20
like
years? I thought it was like 50 years or something.
Yeah, it may have been longer. It was like a long period of time, long enough for like his wife to have changed and like all these other things to have happened. So, that's an example of a perspective world that doesn't actually involve like fantasy or things that couldn't happen in the real world. Somebody who went into a coma, I've seen a lot of jokes about this, and I think, it's an interesting premise of like if you went into a coma right before coronavirus started and then you woke up in the middle of it, like that would be kind of a perspective world where something about your experience of the world was different than other people's. So that could involve fantasy, but it doesn't necessarily have to involve fantasy. So let's keep going. So, that's okay, go ahead.
Oh, that reminds me of the Breath of the Wild, where the character is asleep for 100 years and they wake up to an apocalypse, and you have to
Oh yeah,
like
that's a great example. So our world is pretty straightforward. It's just the world that, we as humans experience where everything is exactly the same. So there's, gravity works the same way. There's no magic, there's no dragons. It's like everything is exactly the same. So that's for, more realistic stories, things where we want to recreate the world that we live in. Can you guys think of examples of that?
Wait, sorry, what was the question?
Sort of like any sort of like Battlefield or Call of Duty, which isn't like, exactly the same since it's not
Yeah.
that realistic, but it takes place in a similar world at least.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, maybe
The
like
classic example for
Division?
that would be like, sorry, what?
Oh, I said like Division. That's literally set in Manhattan, but it isn't
Oh
Manhattan.
yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, it's like very like faithfully recreating the city and the maps and all that stuff. So that's a good example as well. The Sims is one that would be a good reference there, where the stuff that The Sims is based on is just like the real world.
Metal Gear.
Yeah, I guess that one is a little bit like it's
Loosely.
not everybody's
Loosely.
everyday world, but yeah.
Did you say
Yeah.
Metal Gear?
What about Max Payne?
Oh yeah, Max Payne. Or Bully.
I don't remember.
Max Payne is pretty realistic.
Bully would
Really?
be, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so those are some good examples. So let's keep going. So sci-fi. What distinguishes sci-fi from fantasy? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Science.
It's more, yeah, like more the technological or logical.
Yeah, instead of being like all magical and stuff, it's more like high tech.
Yeah. So yeah, you guys all had the same sort of idea that something about the science or the technology of the world is different from our world. So it's not fantasy because it's not, it's based on some possible science or some possible technology, but it's more advanced or it's, some different variant of what we have in the real world.
And sci-fi usually seems, I guess, more like reachable. Like it seems more possible.
Sure. Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
good.
and
That's a good
to an
point.
extent, sci-fi kind of is a fantasy.
Yeah, but I think there is this distinction that typically, not always, but typically in sci-fi, and there's also combinations of sci-fi and fantasy. But normally in sci-fi, as was mentioned, it's something that could be possible. Like it's based on some scientific principle. So the next one is historical or period. So this is obviously something that takes place in a different historical time and kind of tries to recreate the world of that historical time. Any examples for this?
Assassin's
Oregon
Creed would be a
Trail?
good example.
Call
Yeah,
of Duty
Assassin's Creed.
World at War.
Yeah, those are
Evil
all good.
Search for Eden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Assassin's Creed is usually the first one, so
Yeah,
that
Red Dead Redemption for sure.
yeah,
Ghost of
definitely.
Tsushima.
Say Evil Search for Eden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Oregon Trail was a good reference too. That's not one that I always hear, so that's a good one as well. So yeah, that one's pretty. Yeah, these are all good examples. Mythological. So what are some examples of mythological, and what makes mythological different than fantasy or sci-fi?
God of War.
Yeah, like Greek mythology.
It's based on myth.
Yeah. So usually a mythological story either has like reference to real mythology, like written, by different cultures or whatever, or it kind of takes on the sort of trappings of, Greek mythology or Norse mythology or mythology from other cultures. So like older stories and tales and stuff like that. So it kind of like borrows references from that either directly or sort of indirectly. Fictional world. So this is taking on an existing fictional world. This one is a little bit, it's kind of similar to a lot of other ones, but the real distinction here is like you're taking somebody else's fictional world and you're building a game inside of it. So like the example that I have here is just like building a Star Trek game. So Star Trek already exists as a TV franchise, but if you make a game based on Star Trek, you kind of have to use the TV franchise as the basis for your what you're doing in the game. So that's going to determine, you know, the type of outfits that people are wearing and the way that the spaceship looks like and all that kind of thing. I think that's the last one. So you know, here's the example of Star Trek, where even like the outside of the arcade, like everything about the visuals, the setting reinforces the idea of that that world. And then I had another one here, but I guess it didn't get published. That's weird. That's okay. I thought I had another example, but let's just keep going. So after we kind of choose the type of world, we have to think about the physical dimensions of the world. Using 2D games, we're going to be a little bit more limited because we only have 2 dimensions. But we can kind of imitate 3-dimensional if we're doing like isometric or other types of 2D games. But usually the physical dimensions have to do with like, you know, how big is this world? Like how big are the buildings? How wide are the streets? Whatever it is that we're thinking about. Then I kind of just touched on this, but 2D versus 3D games. So deciding to do it in one versus the other may change the decisions that you make as you're designing the game. We're going to be making 2D games, so we don't really have to think about this one. But I'm hoping that in the future we'll have a second version of this class that'll focus on 3D. You know, that's something that I'm working on now. So we don't have to think too much about that. Then we have to think about the boundaries. So, you know, sometimes the boundaries are very clearly defined. Like in Tetris, you know, it's just a block and everything is inside the block. Other times we have to explore the edges of the game to find the boundaries. So we have to think about, that's another decision we make as game designers, is does this exist like in the fishbowl where we can see the edges? Or do we want to pretend that we're outside of the fishbowl, give the user sort of the simulation or the idea that the world could go on forever. So once we make that decision, then we have to kind of choose different ways to indicate that to the player. The scale of the game is important. Like if we're dealing with monsters, then we need more space so that the monsters can be really big and we can be really small. If everything in the game is the same size, then we don't have to have as much space. So, you know, in realistic games like The Sims, we base the scale on reality. So like a person is, you know, the relative height of 2 people should be pretty similar. And the relative height of like a person to a street or a house or whatever should be similar. Other games, and the example I use here is Katamari. You might have like really wild scale changes just to create the sort of fantasy of the world that you're creating. So we can see a couple examples. So The Sims, everything is very realistic. Like everything in the game is proportional in scale to a person that we see in the game. In Katamari, it's very much the opposite. Like there is this sort of, the overall map has this kind of like sense of realism. Like the, you know, the houses aren't like totally out of proportion with the cars and stuff like that. But in Katamari, we're like sticking everything together and we're building this like kind of crazy fantasy thing. So the scale is a little bit, you know, fictional in Katamari. So some elements. So we're going to start thinking about scenic elements. And this week, you guys will start by looking at them in other games. And then next week, we'll actually start to design them ourselves. So we're going to ignore anything that's interactive, characters, other players. We're just going to focus on the setting. So we can think about the terrain. So that's kind of like the ground, roads, dirt, grass, you know, water, other things like that that cover like large parts of the ground.
I'm in class, huh? What happened?
Just gonna go ahead and mute. There's also rules that make up the setting. So things like gravity or wind, you know, those kind of like the physical world is made up of these different rules. Like if you're underwater, there's less gravity. If you're in space, there's no gravity. So even though we can't actually see gravity and we can't see wind, they do kind of affect the setting that we're in, or at least the way that things behave in the setting. Flora and fauna, these are fancy words for flora is like plants and trees and stuff, and fauna is animals. So if you have a game that's set in outer space, you're not going to have either one of those things. But if you have a game that's set underwater, you're going to have like fish and like amoebas and stuff floating around because to suggest that we're underwater. So thinking about both the sort of plant life and also the animal life that we is there as visuals, not as things that we can interact with. So there might be some fish floating by. If they're just there to look at that setting, if we can like eat them or whatever, then they become part of the, a part of the game dynamics. Cultural artifacts. So you could have like a bookshelf or, different like religious symbols if you're working with, religious myths or something like that. So things that are man-made, but that we're not going to interact with. They just kind of create the scenery around us. And I guess that was it. So we have those like different parts to work with. There may be other things that you guys can think of to throw in there. So we also have to think a little bit about screen space as we're creating the setting. So we have to think about how do we divide up the screen to imply the dimensionality of the world. Since we're working with 2D space, that's a little bit harder, but we can have like kind of things that are farther away. So they'd be smaller in the background versus things that might be closer and larger. So we can think about background versus foreground. We can also think about vertical space, like what are things that are normally at the top of a world, like clouds or trees or whatever, versus things that are normally at the bottom. So we can create space that way. Horizontal space, obviously, same thing with that, but in a different direction. Like what are things that travel horizontally? What are things that take place over a horizontal dimension? We can also think about physical time. So does time behave like it does in the real world? Can time be slowed down somehow? How does that change the way that the world looks? So those are kind of the different elements. And as you're trying to think about the setting, I think this is a good thing to do is to say, okay, I need like a few things for my setting. So what can I think of that falls under the category of flora? Well, I'll put some trees or I'll put some, grass or something like that. So that can kind of help you get started. Another thing that will help you get started is looking at different inspiration. So I have some links to different things that I find inspiring when I want to think about a game world. That can be different for everybody. So there's no real, hard rule with this. But I just added a few links of things. They're kind of, some of them are like a little silly, but I think you guys will see what I mean. So this is the creative aquariums that I linked the image to at the beginning. And a lot of these are very simple. They're just kind of like silly, different little aquariums, but they give you a sense of like creating different perspectives and different kind of like framings of spaces. And the thing I like about the aquarium is it's contained, so we can kind of think what are the boundaries and how do we suggest that things go beyond the boundaries. So there's a lot of different examples in here, and I think some of them actually really look like game worlds, some of them less so. But there's the one I had in the notes. So then gardens are another good thing to look at. In particular with gardens, there's a lot of thought that goes into designing a garden to get people to walk around it and look at different things, and also colors. So colors in gardens are really important, just like colors in games are. As we kind of talked about with the character design, we want some colors to stick out and to draw our attention to them. We also want some other colors to kind of fade in the background, and depending on what our setting is, those might be different colors. For the garden, obviously there's a lot of green, and then the color of the flowers kind of stands out. And then the combination of those colors becomes really important because we'll either have like a lot of harmony between the colors, or we may have more discord. And I really like this video because it really is like, it's almost just like game design 101, like how to create sort of like different how to create a scene. So repetition is really important. You can't like hand draw every single part of the game, so you have to repeat some stuff. And variation is important. So to create a more natural look, you need, not just like one tree after the other. You have to have some variation, different textures. There's a whole bunch of them in here. It's the last one. Yeah, different colors. So that's a cool video. That one's pretty short. There's another one I have. It's a bit longer. I want to get to the part where we see. Yeah, so we can see these different designs. And a lot of these principles are pretty similar. It's pretty interesting. So, gardens are one thing. There's lots of other spaces that are designed. Landscape design is another kind of like way to think about designing space. This is another video that kind of goes through some different principles. So contrast between different colors is really good. There's a whole bunch of different stuff in here. Talks a bit about color theory. So thinking about what colors you're combining in the space, how different colors stick out. Scale, we kind of talked about scale a little bit when we were talking about games. There's a few different principles in here. Let's go to this one. Rhythm is a good one. So all of these things really apply in interesting ways, thinking about designing a game. Terrariums are kind of similar to aquariums, but they're not underwater. So it's a kind of a similar concept, but you can see this is just like literally a Google image search of terrarium design, but you can see how they kind of create these spaces that suggest a lot of depth and a lot of sort of variety in these like tiny little glass bowls and stuff like that. So that's another good place to look for inspiration. And then aquascaping is just the practice of designing your aquarium. So there's a lot of good principles in here. I recommend you guys look into these articles a little bit more deeply if you want to kind of like think about this more. And even if you don't like apply these principles directly, it'll get you to start thinking about, like, instead of just saying, here's my game, here's a road, here's some buildings, like just throwing stuff on there, actually really thinking about where you want things to go and how to create the game world to suggest different things about that game. So that is it for this. I'm gonna stop the recording and I'm gonna talk a little bit about the assignment. But first, okay, let me stop the recording.